Altaussee salt mine, Austria, May 1945. 21 kilometers of tunnels wind through the mountain, carved for salt extraction but converted in the war's final years into the single largest hidden art repository the Nazi regime ever assembled. American soldiers descending into the darkness find something no inventory could have prepared them for: the Ghent Altarpiece, Michelangelo's Bruges Madonna, and thousands of other paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts stacked in climate-controlled chambers, alongside crates marked with a chilling label. 8 sealed boxes containing enough explosive to bring the entire mountain down. Local Nazi officials had weeks earlier been ordered to destroy everything, rather than let it fall into Allied hands. The order was quietly disobeyed by miners and resistance figures working in secret. What the Allies discover at Altaussee is not simply looted art. It is proof that an entire continent's cultural inheritance had been catalogued, hidden, and nearly incinerated by the same bureaucratic machine that had catalogued and nearly destroyed so much else. This is not where the looting ends. It is where the equally enormous task of sorting it all out begins. The scale of what the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives section, the small Allied unit tasked with this work, now faces defies easy summary. Across Germany and Austria, repositories like Altaussee sit hidden in castles, mine shafts, monasteries and private estates, the accumulated result of years of systematic confiscation from museums, private collections and, overwhelmingly, from Jewish families stripped of their possessions before deportation. Rather than attempting to process this material where it was found, scattered across hundreds of individual sites, Allied authorities make an early decision that will shape the entire restitution effort. Consolidate everything into a small number of central collecting points, secure, documented and staffed by specialists trained to research each object's origin before deciding its fate. But that was only the beginning of the problem, not the solution to it. The first central collecting point opens at Marburg in the spring of 1945, chosen simply because its museum and archive buildings had survived Allied bombing relatively intact. It proves too small and too provisional almost immediately, closing in June 1946 with its contents transferred elsewhere. The 2 facilities that come to define the entire restitution effort are established that same year. Wiesbaden, built around the former Prussian State Museum's own collections and eventually holding more than 700,000 individual objects, and Munich, converted from the very buildings the Nazi Party itself had used, including Hitler's own former office, which at its peak holds over 1 million objects moving through its inventory system. The documents reveal something the popular telling of the monuments men rarely captures. Cataloguing a painting was never simply a matter of hanging a label on it. Each object arriving at a collecting point required researchers to reconstruct a chain of ownership, sometimes deliberately obscured through years of forced sales, fraudulent paperwork, and Nazi-era transactions designed specifically to look legitimate on paper. A painting seized directly from a museum in occupied France carried a comparatively simple trail. A painting that had passed through a Jewish family forced to sell it under duress in 1938, then resold twice more through dealers who asked no questions, presented a genuinely difficult historical puzzle, one that photography interrogation records and captured German administrative documents had to painstakingly reconstruct piece by piece. Picture the working conditions inside the Munich collecting point in its first 18 months of operation. Rooms lined floor to ceiling with paintings still in their Nazi-era shipping crates, photography stations documenting each piece before storage, and a small staff of monuments officers, many of them art historians and museum curators in civilian life. Cross-referencing captured Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg shipping, manifests against claims arriving daily from museums and private families across a dozen countries, each claim requiring verification before a single object could legally change hands again. Another problem soon emerged, one that complicated even successful restitution. Ownership was rarely as simple as a name on a pre-war inventory. Some claimants had died in the Holocaust, with no surviving heirs to receive their property. Some pre-war owners had emigrated and could not be immediately located. Some objects had been sold under circumstances ambiguous enough that monuments officers, working case by case with limited legal guidance, had to make judgment calls about what constituted a forced sale under Nazi pressure versus a genuine, if unfortunate, pre-war business transaction. The paperwork alone captured Nazi records, pre-war sales receipts, wartime shipping manifests, post-war claims forms, created an archive of its own, nearly as vast as the physical collection it documented. Yet the most consequential organizational decision had already been made well before individual claims began arriving in volume. Rather than keeping all categories of material together, the 3 surviving collecting points were deliberately specialized by mid-1946, Munich handling the bulk of material requiring restitution to foreign governments and the Bavarian state museums, Wiesbaden managing German-owned material, and a third site at Offenbach, opened specifically to handle an entirely different category of loss: Jewish books, religious objects, and archives seized not for their monetary value, but as part of a deliberate campaign to erase Jewish cultural and religious life from occupied Europe. What followed was a restitution process that moved, by the standards of post-war bureaucracy, with genuine speed for its most straightforward cases. The overwhelming majority of objects with clear, documented pre-war ownership by a foreign government or museum were returned within the first year of operation, entire trainloads of paintings and sculpture crossing back into France. The Netherlands and Belgium by late 1945, the Ghent Altarpiece itself restored to St. Bavo's Cathedral not long after its discovery at Altaussee. The harder cases, individual claims, disputed ownership, objects with no surviving claimant at all, stretched on for years afterward, some remaining unresolved for decades, occasionally resurfacing in ownership disputes that continue into the present day. But one building outlasted the process it had been built to house. Long after the last claim had been processed, the Führerbau in Munich, the very office Hitler himself had once used, stood for years afterward still faintly recognizable as what it had briefly become in between. Not a monument to the regime that built it, nor purely a museum storeroom, but a strange administrative purgatory where a continent's stolen memory had been sorted, catalogued, and case by case handed back. Debriefing assessed as a documentation and restitution problem rather than a purely military or cultural one, the Allied handling of Nazi looted art reveals 3 defining pressures and 1 unfinished legacy. First, consolidation into a small number of central collecting points, rather than processing material at hundreds of individual discovery sites, proved essential to making restitution possible at all, allowing specialist researchers to work systematically rather than repeating the same investigative process at every isolated repository across 2 occupied countries. Second, the true difficulty was never physical recovery but documentation. Objects looted through legally disguised transactions, forced sales dressed up as ordinary commerce, required painstaking historical reconstruction that pure military logistics could never have solved, work that depended entirely on the specific expertise of art historians serving in uniform. Third, the specialization of the collecting points by category of material, foreign restitution, German-owned property, and Jewish cultural heritage, allowed the process to move with reasonable speed for its clearest cases, while acknowledging implicitly that some categories of loss required entirely different kinds of institutional attention than others. The unfinished legacy is one still being written today. Objects with no surviving claimant were, in many cases, ultimately returned to German state custody or transferred to Jewish successor organizations, representing the interests of communities the original owners could no longer speak for themselves. Provenance research initiated by monuments officers in the late 1940s continues in museums and archives worldwide even now, a paper trail begun in the immediate aftermath of war that, for a meaningful number of paintings still hanging in galleries around the world, has never been fully closed.